because it's what gave people of color the ability to not be discriminated in public spaces, in schools, and were able to be voter registration. So that is also how the law of the Title V1 was put into place for public education. And we're going to talk about Title V1 in the next slide and just really go into depth about what that is and how it affects our ELL students. But our Civil Rights Act of 1964, the effect on those ELL students was these students were able to go into schools and we were able to have equality in these schools and not segregation. So there was exposure to hearing peers speak English, and that's one of the biggest advantages that English language learners need to have in school. This helps their communication skills in English when they become proficient learners. They need to hear English in order to learn it. If they're in a school and they're segregated and all these other students only speak Spanish, Chinese, whatever language we're discussing, they are going to hear English, and that really puts them behind because if you're not communicating with it, you can never learn it. So without this act, students might not have the opportunity to immerse themselves with their peers that speak different languages than them. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide where we talk about Title V1. And this was also on July 2nd, 1964. Like I said, this was put into place when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was established. This was a primary education law, and it was an educational program that required the federal government to provide financial assistance for primary schools. When the federal government requires schools to have financial assistance in the schools, this is a big deal. We need finances in these schools so we can pay teachers who are bilingual and are trained in that, so that way they can pass their knowledge and instruct these students in the proper way. And also, the way students need to learn is by having a teacher that is proficient in the native tongue that they are familiar with. I think that's so important, and so whenever we're having these funds, that helps to be able to pay teachers like that. It also provides different types of resources for these students to be able to reach their full potential and also be able to be proficient English speakers. So how does this affect our ELL students? Like I said, without proper funding, it's very difficult for students to receive appropriate instruction to become proficient in English. So the Bilingual Education Act is next, and that was in January 2nd of 1968. This was the first law that the government enforced assistance to students who struggled with English speaking skills. So elements that were in this act were train teachers and aides, develop bilingual instructional content, encourage parent involvement. So those three things were the main elements that were in the Bilingual Education Act. So whenever we're talking about this act, we want to remember that these are the three components, because first off, we do want our parents to be involved. That way, whenever they go home, when our students go home, even today, we want them to be hearing native tongue, of course, but we also want maybe a little bit of English in home so they can hear both and be more immersed into that English language. Like I said in the previous slide, it is so important to have trained teachers that know a native tongue and know English at the same time, so where our students can hear both and communicate in both. And we need to have good bilingual instructional content. If the content isn't there, it's going to be very hard to reach students in an engaging and connecting way. So how does the Bilingual Education Act affect our ELL students? Well, I think this was the first step in having support from the U.S. government, which would be a crucial step. Even if the act wasn't foolproof, it became a step in the right direction. Even though this act was the first, obviously it's going to have its flaws, but I think that it was a step in the right direction, and which would lead into multiple different acts happening. So Law versus Nichols, this was another trial, and this was in January 21st of 1974. This was a case that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of non-English speaking students. They ruled that a California school district must provide funds for these students and the instruction to teach them English. So This case was kind of tricky because it made them provide funds, but it also allowed them to pick the own type of instruction that they wanted to give students. So you wanted to make sure they were receiving proper teachers and instructions, but you couldn't make sure that they were receiving those types of instructions because you gave them that type of freedom, which is also something else that I will talk about later on. So it affected our ELL students because it fell under the Civil Rights Act, and that would provide protection against discrimination. And funding is a major contribution to schools that allow ELL students to receive proper teachers and instruction. The Equal Education Opportunities Act was in August 21st, 1974. So this was a law that was signed by President Nixon, and it was a part of the law decision to become a part of the U.S. Code. So this act required all public state schools to provide students who do not speak English opportunities no matter their race, gender, color, or nationality. So like I said before, we were going to talk about how this would affect our ELL students. We want to make sure they're having opportunities for having 2 classes for their non-native speakers and for native speakers so they can be immersed in English and in their native tongue. So the students in classrooms today now have the opportunity to practice their native language while also receiving assistance to become proficient in English. The Regents of University versus Back was in 1978, and this was a Supreme Court case, and it ruled that the usage of racial quotas for its admission process was unconstitutional. This was between Alan Black and University of California, and he believed that the University of California was violating the Title V1 and the 14th Amendment. And the court found that by following this quota was racial discrimination against certain racial groups. So this affects ELL students because when students aren't accepted into a school that could further their education and diversity of exposure, they are being deprived of future education opportunities. So amendment to the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, this was placed in 1982, and it was just an amendment to the Bilingual Education Act that I talked about earlier. And it wanted to increase the flexibility of this act. It wanted to provide the schools a decision on how their LEP students should be taught and how they would be able to apply for different types of funding so they could personally decide the needs of their students. I think this affects our ELL students today because it can be either a positive or negative thing. I think giving schools freedom, they know what's best for their students, but that doesn't mean technically they're going to put in that funding to follow those guidelines. You want to make sure that they still are following the guidelines and not give them complete freedom, I believe. The Bilingual Education Act reauthorized was in 1984, and it was reauthorized so that we could set up programs that promote bilingualism, but also indigenous languages as well. And it gave a guide to schools of how to instruct students who are bilingual. So giving these schools a guideline provides them with something that will help them make sure that all students are going to be reached. And I think indigenous languages are getting more common in schools today. So I think it's a very important and critical to provide programs for those students as well. So here's my Works Cited page. I received tons of information from the Evolution of Federal Policy that was linked on Blackboard that had so many timelines and dates. And then I also pulled some information about Friend and Bursuck and just took knowledge of what we've been learning over the course of the semester to kind of implement ELL students' needs and base them off the federal policy. So thank you so much.